There's more on this now with Henry Newman, Director of Open Europe, a think tank focusing on the relationship between the UK and the EU after Brexit. He was also previously former Special Advisor to Michael Gove. Henry, welcome. Thanks very much for coming in. £100 million on ferries. I mean, and rather last minute, isn't it?
Well, I think the government's actually doing the right thing here. So we've had a lot of criticism that they weren't doing enough to prepare for no deal. They weren't doing enough publicly. But actually, we are now less than 3 months almost from leaving the European Union, deal or not, at the end of March. So the government has to put these plans in place to make sure that they can minimise any possible disruption at the borders. And what they can't do, of course, is control what happens on the other side of the channel in France. What we're seeing here is that they're preparing to increase supply in alternate routes besides the main Dover to Calais link.
How much of a sign is this, then, that the government really thinks we are heading more likely towards a no-deal Brexit?
Well, I don't think a no-deal Brexit is the likely outcome. I still think there's one deal on the table, and that's the Prime Minister's deal. And
sorry to interrupt you, but MPs from all parties don't like this deal. They're saying when they finally get a chance to have this meaningful vote, they're going to say no.
Well, they may say no, and they may say no initially, and then the government may try to reintroduce this. And I think time is on the government's side, because ultimately nobody else has a deal on the table, only the Prime Minister. Her deal isn't perfect. I've got lots of things I could complain and quibble about it. But ultimately, if you're facing down at a timetable where we're going to leave the EU, deal or not, at the end of March, and MPs, of course, themselves voted for that. We had the Gina Miller case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the government had to seek the authorisation of MPs before they could trigger Article 50, the EU exit mechanism. They did that, and that put us on a course to leave the European Union. And MPs are now turning around and saying, well, why are you preparing for no deal? Well, because MPs, Parliament, instructed the government to pull the exit cord.
You're saying that the government has time on its side, but it doesn't have time, and it's leverage, surely.
Sure. So it has time on its side in the sense that as we get closer and closer to the exit date, I think the fact that they are the ones with a plan, that's the deal that they've negotiated with Brussels, will become more and more clear. So MPs who now say, look, I don't love this plan, I would vote against it, what they're saying to me in private is, ooh, actually, I may have to swallow my concerns and basically take the only safe option.
We could, of course, spend all of this interview talking about the likelihood of the deal getting through or not, but we're here to talk about this ferry contingency plan. There's been criticism of it. The Liberal Democrat leader, Vince Cable, has said it's complete madness and ironic that most of this money is going to European companies, and yet we're trying to get ourselves out of the EU. Yeah,
well, I think it's interesting that the Liberal Democrats are obviously trying to complain about whatever the government is doing. But I think, as I said at the beginning, if the government wasn't preparing to resolve some of the possible disruption that could happen in the event of no deal, they would rightly be criticised for not preparing. So I think the government is in one of these positions where it's damned if it does and it's damned if it doesn't. It doesn't have a majority in its own right in Parliament, so they have to rely on the other parties to get any business through the Commons. And if the Liberal Democrats are worried about leaving without a deal, they can vote for a deal, and then we can leave with a deal, and they won't need to use these additional ferry routes.
But those who voted Remain were accused of creating fear that some of the contingency plans that would need to be put into place were a fiction, that they wouldn't be necessary, that trade would continue seamlessly without friction. That clearly isn't going to happen if we're having to spend all this money on ferries. What other contingency plans need to be put in place?
Well, I think there's two different things to say there. First of all, trade could continue if we leave without any disruption, really, if we leave under the current deal, because that would give us a transition period of 21 months.
These ferries are not about that.
Yes,
these ferries are about the no deal
So if we leave without a deal, there could be disruption on trade, and that'll mainly be on goods going into the European Union. But of course, what happens then is if we can't get our goods into France or into Belgium or into the Netherlands, then things back up and you get immediate congestion on the border. So that is a real risk, and it's a big problem. And that's why the government is trying to take this sort of step. And there are many other problems that would happen in the event of no deal. Now, those wouldn't be insurmountable, but they would mean that for potentially several months, there was quite severe disruption on the borders.
But a lot of people who do or don't want to leave, how alarmed will they be, do you think, that this is the kind of measure that's necessary, the kind of money that is needed to keep us open for business?
We're not talking about a huge amount of money here. I mean, it's obviously an important amount of money, but it's not an enormous amount of money in the scheme of things. We're talking about, as part of our net contribution, about a week's contribution to the EU. So it's not in the scheme of things actually very much money on this specific scheme. But I think people who voted to leave did recognise, by and large, that this would mean some degree of disruption. They probably thought over the medium term that was the price worth paying, or that was something that they're willing to see. What I don't think anybody really wants to see, though, is serious disruption, which is why I think that everybody should think very carefully about what the best option is in this scenario. We've got three choices broadly. Either we leave without a deal, which would risk this sort of disruption, these problems at the ports and elsewhere, or we leave with the Prime Minister's deal, which at least is a safe path through which both sides have agreed, or we don't leave at all, in which case we either have to have a general election or a second referendum and all the complications. Of course, some people would like that, but I think many people would also recognise that's far from an easy path. So the problem is there are three options out there. None are that easy, but often in politics, that's just the way it is.
Henry Newman from the Open Europe think tank. Thank you.